Ukraine has confirmed it launched an overnight drone attack on a military airfield inside Russia. The base is located nearly 300 kilometres from the Ukrainian border. The Lipetsk governor has declared a state of emergency and says 4 nearby villages have been evacuated. The attack comes as Russia fights to push back Ukrainian troops closer to the border near Kursk. Moscow says at least 1,000 Ukrainian troops entered Russian territory there on Tuesday. Military analyst Marina Miron joins us from Munich. What more can you tell us 4 days into this operation?
Good day, Ben. Well, it looks like Ukraine has prepared at least a tactical surprise for the Russians and tried to emulate what the Russians did in Kharkiv. And this is being done in absence of a clear strategy of victory in both political and military terms. So the idea here is not just to shift the narrative, because in the past months, Ukraine didn't come out on top in the information space, also in the Western information space especially. So this is a way to shift the narrative for Ukraine on the one hand, to boost morale for its own internal audience and its troops, and more importantly, to position itself in a better way if it comes to potential negotiations, because we have to remember the wider context and the fact that there will be elections in the United States in November, and this might determine the fate of Ukraine. So right now, Ukraine thinks it's better off if it can have that little bit of territory from Russia in order to be in a better negotiating position. And of course, it would help Ukraine to several Russian logistics, because Suja is where major roads are. It's a logistical hub. So it is an important town. And therefore, Ukraine went for that town. And I foresee that there will be more attacks like this, maybe on Belgorod, or maybe on the Kerch Bridge, or even both, in order to improve its position.
So basically, take parts of Russia to keep up their sleeve in negotiations in getting back parts of Ukraine. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct, yes.
How far have the Ukrainians managed to push into Russian territory?
Well, according to some sources, they took some 350 square kilometers of the territory. The problem is, however, and that is why I said it's a sort of a strategy of tactics, because Ukraine had to move troops from other directions, and potentially the 42nd Brigade from Pokrovsk direction. So it's using the forces that it could have used elsewhere along the line of contact. And the question is, how far will Ukrainian armed forces be able to progress or even to hold the territories that they are currently occupying? Hence, I'm saying that this is more done for a media effect, because elsewhere the Ukrainian forces on the Ukrainian territory facing the Russians are not in a good position.
So how dangerous do you think this move really is, considering it could put its forces in other parts in danger?
Well, it could lead to the Russians taking Pokrovsk. It could lead to the Russians taking Chasiv Yar and advancing to Slovensk and Kramatorsk. And from the rhetoric, this move could psychologically backfire. Instead of hurting the Russian morale, it could boost the Russian morale and force the Russian leadership to reconsider its current aims in Ukraine and push further. And we have heard Medvedev saying that they should go for Odessa and other cities which were not on the list, or at least not officially on the list. So it remains to be seen what is going to happen. However, this tactical move is very costly for Ukraine, and so the hope is that the Ukraine will be able to achieve its desired effect. But it's difficult to predict whether that will be the case.
Marina, you say costly. What sort of financial means and military might does Ukraine have right now?
Well, I'm talking costly in terms of material and personnel, specifically because we have seen some videos of Stryker and Bradley vehicles being lost in the Kursk region. We don't know the exact number of Ukrainian losses, so that is difficult to estimate. However, there will be losses, and we're still waiting for a full Russian response to this incursion. And Ukraine is probably hoping that Russia will remove its forces from, say, Kharkiv because of the proximity in order to weaken the pressure on the Ukrainian forces there, but Russia hasn't done it yet. So it remains to be seen how much losses Ukraine will have to endure against the background that General Syrskyi was actually planning a potential counteroffensive at some point in fall. So will Ukraine then have enough forces and means in order to conduct it, given that the mobilization is not going as planned, given that there are delays in delivering of Western equipment to Ukraine? So Ukraine is in a very shaky position right now, and I think it doesn't have any good choices. This is why we're seeing this incursion.
Interesting analysis there from Marina Miron. Many thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Stephen Blank is a senior fellow at the American think tank, the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Welcome. What do you think Ukraine aims to achieve with this big incursion into Russian territory?
I think they intend to achieve a number of objectives. First of all, I think psychologically they're taking the war to Russia, which is going to improve not only domestic morale, but undermine Russian morale and show the Russian people that Russia is not winning and that the war can be brought home to them. Secondly, they're going to probably take out key Russian logistics targets and energy refinery centers in the town of Sudzha, which is near where they made their raid. I don't think it's really an invasion. And they're going to undermine the Russian army by striking at its logistics, as they have done throughout the war, which has been a very effective tactic for them. So it's a very daring and high-risk operation, but it seems to have paid off.
Well, it comes at a cost too, right? Because Ukraine's forces are quite stretched at the moment, particularly in the Donbass region, where there's a real push by Russian troops right now. Do you think that this is a good use of Kiev's resources?
Well, it's clear that Kiev thinks so, regardless of what I may think. And I actually think it's also very good. It's certainly psychologically disorienting to Moscow and to Putin. And again, if they can disrupt the logistics of the Russian army and prevent it from moving by destroying energy supplies, then they will have achieved their objectives.
Do you believe, the way you're talking about it sounds a little bit like it's an act, it's a publicity act in some ways. Do you feel like this is gearing up toward some kind of positioning to come into negotiations with a better hand of cards, as it were?
Well, I wouldn't call it a publicity act. I think it's a raid. I mean, it's intended to have a psychological impact on the enemy, and I think that's a classic objective in wartime. But as for negotiation, sure, it tells the Russians, look, you know, we can invade, we can get into your country and destroy a lot of infrastructure. This is not, you don't have a monopoly on that ability. And after what the Russians have been doing in Ukraine for 2 years, by systematically attempting to destroy all of Ukraine's infrastructure, it shows that we can do the same to you.
How is Russia explaining this to the people of Russia, who at this point aren't even allowed to call it a war within Russia?
Well, Putin is calling it an invasion, a provocation. All that indicates that they were rattled and that they were completely caught by surprise and that they don't have a good answer for this. You know, this is not an invasion of Russia because we know what an invasion of Russia would look like. And it's certainly not a provocation because, after all, Russia's been striking at Ukrainian territory for 2.5 years now. So once again, I mean, Russia has been caught flat-footed. And I think that's what these attempts to attack Ukraine and say that also that the West is behind all this are just simply reflections of its dismay.
We heard about fighting in Sudzha. What's interesting there is that it's the last transit point for Russian gas headed to Europe through Ukraine. Is that a vulnerability for Ukraine that they should take into account?
It's a vulnerability for Russia because it is the last station on the way to Europe. And by striking at Russian gas transit to Europe, you deprive Moscow of a lot of revenue. And the revenue is what's going to finance the war. So here again, it has important strategic objectives in mind.
All right, Stephen Blank from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you.